Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Scale with Joy podcast. I am here with Nikki Rausch. She is the CEO of Sales Maven. Thank you, Nikki, for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here with you.
Yeah, awesome. So you're CEO of Sales Maven.
Hmm.
You talk a lot about selling without being salesy. Like,
Yes.
how do you increase your likability without even chatting people up and tap dancing and doing all of the crazy things that people think that you should do when you're selling?
Well, okay. So that's such an interesting question in that the idea here is people like to buy from people they know, like, and trust. So think about the impression that you're making to people. It's funny because I was just interviewing somebody on my own podcast who was a client. We were doing a sales success story, and she's an image consultant. And we were talking about this idea that oftentimes you hear this comment about, like, dress for the job that you want, right? And I think sometimes people forget in sales that you also need to show up from this place of, are you projecting that image that you're going to attract your ideal client? So are you showing up on time? Are you ready? And when I say ready, like, are you the person who gets onto camera with a prospective client and you're like fixing your hair and fixing your makeup? Well, that shows like you weren't really ready for that meeting, right? So you have to show up from this place of being credible and being ready to
Yes.
have conversations with people in whatever way that you show up. But it matters and it counts and it leaves an impression.
Yeah. What are some other ways that you can kind of increase your likability? I've been thinking a lot about this recently because I find myself trying to network more with like local moms and like
Mhm.
I feel like you're a little bit on like Animal Planet where you're like approaching the herd of the local moms. What do
Well,
you say? How do you act? What do they do?
okay.
What do these people talk about? Like,
Yeah. Well, here's what I will say in sales, and this is another idea back to getting rid of this idea of being salesy, is that when you approach somebody, approach with curiosity, approach with this idea of having conversation and asking questions. Because I think one of the mistakes people make in sales is they think that sales is something that you do to somebody.
Mhm.
And I teach that sales is something you do with somebody. And the way that you do with in anything is have conversation. And that means back and forth. That means being willing to ask questions and also being prepared with answers when somebody asks you a question. So approach from this place of being curious about the other person and also being willing to share about you and your own experience and about your business. And yeah, so.
What do you think is like the biggest mistake that people make when they're trying to make a first impression with somebody?
Well, with first impression, so I teach my signature framework for sales and the sales conversation. That's really what I specialize is sales conversation. And I teach that there's a 5-step approach to a sales conversation. I call it the selling staircase. And one of the biggest mistakes that people make is they try to skip steps. So they come up and they meet you and you're like, "Hey, Laura, I read something about your website and I think you probably would really benefit from a sales coach. You should totally hire me." Well, that's skipping a lot of steps, right? Like, first of all, you don't know who I am and I'm approaching you, and you didn't indicate in any way that you're even open to me suggesting something about it. I don't have your permission. We haven't even established if you have any kind of a need or a want for a sales coach, right? So so the idea is you can't skip steps in the process. You need to actually follow through the process and get to the place where you have given me permission to even talk about what I do, and you've given me permission to even make a suggestion of ways that we might work together. And until those things happen, all I'm doing now is just coming across salesy, pushy, and aggressive. And you're going to like shut that down pretty quickly, I would imagine, unless you're just being overly nice to me. But you're probably like, "Hey, lady, go kick rocks. Like, you don't have my permission to even approach me in this way." So the biggest mistake is trying to skip steps.
Yeah, I can totally see that. That's like going up to somebody and being like, gosh, Laura, it looks like you turned 40 right there. Do you want to do something about that without me volunteering at first? Right. And
Yes.
you're a little bit like, oh, that thanks for pointing that out. I mean, maybe I like my smile lines. Maybe it makes me look old
Yeah.
and wise. I mean,
Yeah.
I might like them, I might not, but let me volunteer at first, right?
Yeah, and I'm a little offended that you chose to like point it out, right?
Right.
Like, yeah, so yeah, that's again, big mistake is trying to skip through steps and not establishing rapport and putting the relationship first. Like if you don't have rapport with somebody, you really shouldn't be selling to them.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So what do you think when people say, no, my husband won't let me, it's not going to be a fit for me this time? Why do you think, what comes from no? And do you think there's any way to change it to a yes?
Um, well, I do think that it's important to check it out when, check out and see, because this idea is like somebody's giving you an objection. I will say, just to like qualify this first and foremost, that sometimes no really does mean no, and you need to be respectful of that. But if you have gone through the sales, the selling staircase with somebody, if you've gone through the steps and they've given you permission along the way, and you get to this place where you've issued that invitation for them to work with you and they've declined and you're a little bit surprised because it felt like, gosh, I felt like we were really moving in the right direction here. Something happened, something fell apart. Get curious again and be willing to ask, is it okay to ask your reason for declining if they don't give a reason? Now, if they give the reason of like, I just don't think my husband will let me, it might be worth it for you to check out and go, is that their real objection? Or did I miss a step here some way? Like, is there something that I need to understand? So in that particular case, you want to ask what's known as a conditional close question, which might be, now, is there any additional information that would be helpful for you to have to discuss with your husband that might leave this, that might actually allow for us to work together? Be willing to check to see, is this your real objection? Because maybe they're using it as an excuse because they have a hard time saying no and it feels uncomfortable to them. Or maybe they're like, yeah, he's going to ask about results. Okay, so if I was able to, provide some data and maybe a testimonial or two, or somebody that you could talk to about what kind of results you could expect, would that be something that would be helpful? And then they might go, yeah, that actually would be really helpful. I hadn't even thought to ask you about that. And if you're willing to give me that and I can then go have that conversation, okay, well, that might leave the door still open to work together. So be willing to check it out when you get a no, especially if you're a little bit like, that felt really out of the blue. I felt like we were going in this right direction. Something happened here. Did I miss a step?
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Any other tips that you think like come out during the sales process that people tend to overlook or just aren't really thinking about when they're selling?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that we forget that the prospect doesn't know what the next step is. And
Yeah,
your job is to lead them. And the way that you lead them is through questions. And it's like making sure that you're asking permission to move to each next step. And they're going like, yeah, because if they don't know what to do, they're going to just hang out and never buy. But if
right.
they know what to do because you've put a question in front of them, then they're much more likely to kind of continue the conversation with you. So I guess I gave you a long answer, but the short answer is you need to be willing to put the conversation or put the decision in front of them in a way that makes sense. Like, hey, Laura, is this something you'd be interested in working together on? If you don't ask that question, you might never, if I don't ask you that question, you might never decide to hire me or work together because I never posed the decision and I never put it in front of you.
Yeah, that's such good advice. What do you think is like the one question that you should ask every single client?
I think the one question you should ask every single client is what's important to you in regards to whatever it is that you do.
Yeah,
Because if you don't know what's important to them, it's pretty hard to earn their business and position your offer in a way that is going to make sense.
cool. I love that. Such great advice. So if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you? Like social media, website, blog, where do you hang out?
Well, I'm going to wrap this around a gift for your audience, if that's
Yeah.
okay. The easiest way to connect with me is to download. I have a ebook called Closing the Sale, where it talks through some of the steps of the selling staircase and gives some language suggestions. And your audience can go get that by going to your sales Maven, and it's maven.com/SWJ.
Okay.
So that's for your audience. And then, they can also come check out my podcast, which is Sales Maven, or connect with me on social media. You can find me under Sales Maven.
Awesome. Awesome. Love the consistency. Sales Maven. All right. Well, thank you so much, Nikki, for coming and sharing with our audience. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me.